I canceled my mother-in-law's credit card after discovering she was shopping with my husband's mistress. 4 years I kept my family together in silence, financially supporting everyone and everything while pretending not to see the glances, the lies, and the fake smiles. I was always told that the secret to being a good wife was to be discreet, swallow my pride, and maintain appearances, and I followed that rulebook to the letter. Until the day, while reviewing bank statements, I realized my mother-in-law was spending absurd amounts, alongside a woman I had never seen, but who was much more present in my husband's life than I was. It was at that moment that I stopped being the quiet woman and began to rebuild my own story, step by step, without needing to raise my voice. Today, I know exactly who I am, and the value of the silence of a woman who was once underestimated by everyone. I'm happy to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment from which city you are watching me so that I know how far this story of silent justice is reaching. Dinner was served at a perfect table as always. Fine porcelain, silver cutlery, and soft candles created the setting that Margaret prized so much. She sat upright at the head of the table, with her sharp gaze and rehearsed smile, watching my every move as if I were an employee and not her son's wife. "Are you still wearing that old dress, Madeline?" she commented with a poisonously sweet tone, looking at Andrew. He laughed softly, as if it were an harmless joke. I just smiled, as I had learned to do to survive. Andrew took a glass of wine and said something about how I never really cared much for fashion, making Margaret laugh once more. It was as if my presence were an accessory to his life, something useful but without brilliance. Neither of them mentioned my work, my business, or my achievements. Margaret preferred to talk about Andrew's trip to New York, where he resolved everything with mastery, without ever explaining exactly what he had resolved. I sat there motionless, trying to understand at what point I became invisible even inside my own home. I watched the conversation proceed like a play where I had no lines. Margaret commented on the grandchildren who had not yet arrived, poking at my choice not to have children. Andrew limited himself to chewing slowly, as if each forkful were more important than any word I might say. When I tried to change the subject and talk about a new round of investments in the company, Margaret cut me off. "Oh, those things about numbers, leave them to the men, dear." And Andrew just nodded, as if that were natural. My silence became a shelter against the disguised contempt. I finished my plate without haste, maintaining my composure. Every gesture of mine was measured, controlled, and taught over the years to avoid unnecessary conflicts. But something inside me changed that night. Perhaps it was Margaret's triumphant look, or Andrew's complete lack of interest, or perhaps the simple fact that I was tired of performing. On the outside I continued to smile, but on the inside a wall was slowly cracking. Madeline smiles, but her eyes no longer shine. Andrew did not notice the silence I created between us. He continued talking about himself, his non-existent achievements, and how he managed everything calmly. He said this without blushing, as if he did not know that the house, the car, and even the trips had come out of my personal account. While he gestured, I felt a distance grow between us, not the kind that fights but the kind that gives up. When he turned to Margaret, commenting on how I was too reserved, I realized that the image of a submissive wife was too convenient for him to dismantle. The submissive woman he saw was, in fact, the woman who sustained his entire life. Andrew never cared to know the real Madeline. He liked the version that did not confront him, that did not expose his empty vanity. While he ignored me, I realized how much he needed my passivity to maintain his pose. Every time I let him speak for me was a small concession that today accumulated like an unpayable emotional debt. He never asked what I felt, only if I had already paid his credit card bill. With my eyes fixed on the wall behind him, I realized it would be no use to say anything. Any word of mine would be redirected or belittled. My silence was no longer submissive, it was strategic. If I still pretended, it was for convenience and for a limited time. His words flowed from the corners of his mouth as if they were truths, but I no longer reacted. Inside me, a certainty began to take shape. He didn't even notice that she stopped pretending. I got up from the table before dessert. Margaret complained about my lack of manners, and Andrew made an impatient gesture. I did not apologize. I just left. I went up to the bedroom with silent steps, and upon closing the door, I looked in the mirror. The woman reflected there was not weak, she was strategic. I was being discarded by people who lived at my expense. And it was time to accept something both cruel and liberating. For a long time I had not been respected. Not by them. Not in that house. She silently decides she will no longer save anyone. The next morning, I sat in my private office and opened the credit card statements linked to the main family account. I started with my mother-in-law. Margaret was always subtle in her spending, until I stopped to look more closely. In a single week, she had bought a designer handbag, jewelry, and booked a luxury hotel in Miami. The total value easily exceeded what Andrew used to declare as his salary in family meetings. And everything had been paid for with one of my corporate cards. I went through the papers with more precision, now focused on cross-referencing data. The dates of the expenses coincided strangely with Andrew's strategic trips, which he claimed were for work. I looked at hotel reservations, flights, and the stores visited. There was a pattern, yes. Whenever Margaret made an expensive purchase, Andrew was away. And the locations matched: New York, Miami, Chicago. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was logistics. The value of the bag was higher than Andrew's monthly salary. The more I cross-referenced the information, the clearer it became that there was a simulation in progress. Margaret made the payments, but the benefits were not just hers. They were purchases for someone else. Small-sized clothes, brand-name makeup, spa reservations. They did not match my mother-in-law's profile, but they did match that of a young and demanding woman. The mistress. I didn't have visual proof yet, but the numbers didn't lie. They told a cold, silent, and systematic story. Coincidences became patterns. When my phone vibrated with a message from Natalie, I didn't expect much. "Look at this," she wrote, followed by an image. It was a photo taken discreetly inside a department store in New York. In the foreground were products and displays. But it was the background of the image that paralyzed me. Margaret, beside a stunning young woman, was smiling at Andrew, who was holding a Chanel bag. The three of them were together, exposed by their own arrogance. That wasn't just betrayal. It was blatant contempt for my intelligence. Madeline freezes upon seeing who is in the background of the image. I zoomed in on the image as much as I could. There were no longer any doubts. Margaret's figure, imposing and serene, appeared alongside a young woman I recognized almost immediately, Brielle Monroe. At the center of the image, as if celebrating an achievement, was Andrew. The three of them walked together through the shelves of a luxury store, smiling as if they were a legitimate family. On Andrew's back, the golden Chanel logo shone like a trophy financed by me. It was like watching a play staged to exclude me. Margaret smiled with an almost maternal pride, as if Brielle were her official daughter-in-law. Brielle, in turn, held Andrew's arm with a natural intimacy, not caring about being seen. And Andrew. He seemed at home in that role. Everything was so blatant, so public, that the mockery seemed intentional. As if they knew there would never be consequences. As if they were certain I would never have the courage to confront them. There was no embarrassment. There was no shame. They didn't hide because they felt safe. Because Margaret protected them. Because Andrew thought his charm solved everything. And because Brielle was nothing more than an extension of his ego. And deep down, because they all believed I was permanently silent, blind by choice. They weren't counting on what was happening now. The silent woman had woken up. And unlike them, I would leave no tracks. I closed the image and saved it in 3 different places. That was more than proof. It was the starting line. I didn't need to argue, beg, or threaten. I needed to plan. The pain I felt seeing that image was deep but strangely cold. I didn't lose control. On the contrary, it was then that I understood the strength of someone who, like me, observes before acting. It was a conspiracy in broad daylight. I went down to the safe where I kept the company contracts and property documents. I took out each folder one by one, with the confidence of someone who already knew what she would find. On every page, my name. My name on every property, every bank account, every corporate percentage. I remembered the day Andrew signed, distracted, the fiduciary transfer under Elliot's guidance. Just as a precaution, he had said. Andrew never read what he signed. Margaret never imagined that her invisible daughter-in-law had predicted everything. As I read, I felt the structure I had built over decades strengthen inside me. Everything they used with such arrogance never actually belonged to them. And best of all, everything was protected by clauses and safeguards that completely excluded them. It was as if I had built an empire without anyone noticing, protected by their own inattention. I was the foundation, the pillar. They were just temporary guests in a palace I built with sacrifice. My heart did not race. My stomach did not hurt. I only felt absolute lucidity, as if finally I could see every piece of the game, every move, every disguise. Andrew never had a real position. Margaret never had financial autonomy. Betrayal was just a whim funded by resources she would never understand. I was the architect of all of it. And now the time had come to demolish the castle from the inside. No one can remove her from the throne. I closed the folders with ceremonial care. Nothing more would be done on impulse. I would not scream, I would not confront, I would not explode in grief. That would be giving them the spotlight they always sought. I would choose another path. Cold, elegant, and devastating justice. For that I needed time. And every second would be worth the price. Justice is not improvised. Justice requires evidence, documents, dates, and precision. And that is what I have. Justice needs time and documentation. The first message I sent that morning was to Elliot. Just 2 words, "We start today." He replied in less than a minute with a meeting time. When he arrived at my house, he carried a black briefcase and the sharp look of someone who already foresaw the impact. I placed before him the spreadsheet with all the financial cross-references, dates, and names involved. He read in silence, line by line. When he finished, he smiled. "It will be elegant," he said, closing the folder. We established the cuts. Margaret and Andrew's credit cards, cancellation of bank access permissions, and limitation of automatic transfers. Everything would be done in silence. Elliot knew the mechanisms well. In a few hours, the legal system was already working behind the intact facade of our house. No movement would be noticed until the humiliation happened, public, inevitable, and painful. It was a subtle yet relentless plan. Revenge was never in screams but in details. I set up automatic alerts for every attempted purchase. I wanted to see the moment the realization began to hit them. Elliot, methodical, acted with precision. The notifications began to appear in the early afternoon. Margaret trying to buy exclusive jewelry. Declined. Betrayal trying to pay for a lunch with imported wine. Declined. The same sequence. Denied cards, repeated attempts, growing embarrassment. The system left no room for doubt. The system denied before the machine could beep. The boutique Margaret was in was one of the most expensive in Manhattan. There was no shortage of witnesses. The attendant, initially kind, began to look with suspicion. The manager appeared. They tried another machine. Another card. Nothing. Margaret, with a raised voice, demanded explanations. Betrayal, beside her, began filming discreetly with her cell phone, perhaps trying to protect herself from a possible crisis. Andrew was not present, and it was better that way. The scene was frozen in time like a painting of a fall. 2 women being returned to reality by a simple negative beep. At the same time, my phone began to vibrate. Messages, calls, notifications. Margaret wrote, "Problems with the card. Check please." Betrayal called next. Then Andrew. Then everyone at once. But I didn't answer. I watched the phone vibrate on the table like a desperate animal seeking attention. And I let it die there in the silence I chose to cultivate. The tables had turned. The hysterical call went unanswered. On Monday, the driver did not show up. The cook sent a message apologizing, saying the payment was late, and she preferred not to return until the situation was regularized. At the laundry, clothes were held due to a lack of credit in the system. Margaret tried to call the cleaning service, but the number returned busy or out of service. Andrew, still sleepy, came downstairs demanding coffee, but found the kitchen empty, silent, and with a sink full of dishes. The house that once functioned like a luxury hotel began to grind its gears. No hot coffee, no clean towels, no minimum comforts. Margaret walked back and forth, confused, trying to coordinate services that no longer obeyed. Andrew believed it was just a technical delay, and sent angry messages to the bank manager. And I watched everything with the serenity of someone who had foreseen every step. I felt the artificial structure of the family finally beginning to crumble. No one noticed when I went down, sat at the table, and opened my laptop. They continued blaming others. Employees, systems, applications. They did not consider, even for a moment, that the source had been turned off. Andrew tried to call the bank while Margaret shouted at the flower shop employee over the phone. They were so busy looking for someone to blame that they didn't see the obvious. Nothing had been forgotten. Everything had been planned. And the collapse was just beginning. Breakfast arrived cold and without dishes. Around 11 in the morning, Andrew had a fit of rage. He was on the phone with the bank, demanding explanations. The attendant, patient, informed him that all accounts had been frozen at the request of the primary holder. Andrew got even angrier. "My wife would never do that," he shouted. From the other end of the line, the answer was simple and objective. "Sir, the holder knew exactly what she was doing." He looked at me with incredulity, expecting an explanation, but I just kept typing impassive. He screams, but the answer is insufficient funds. Margaret came up the stairs with firm steps, opened the door to my office without knocking, and said, almost in an indignant whisper, "What is happening, Madeline?" I stared at her without emotion, without anger, without haste. "Everything you have depends on me," I replied calmly. She approached, tried to impose authority, cited traditions, family, and stability. But all of that was nothing more than hollow words. She did not understand how much I had already moved on from that narrative. The empire she thought she controlled was crumbling beneath her own feet. I tried to explain, but I stopped halfway. She wouldn't understand. She wasn't used to losing, much less in silence. Margaret was the type who confused manipulation with wisdom. She didn't realize the moment she lost control of the situation, perhaps because she never truly had it. I left the room, leaving her alone with her own helplessness. In the hallway mirror I saw her reflection. Wide eyes, trembling lips, shaky posture. For the first time she saw herself as she truly was. She realizes she never controlled anything. The next morning, Elliot arrived with a black leather briefcase and a satisfied look. He sat in front of me, took a deep breath, and began to display the documents one by one. There were protection clauses, exclusive authorizations, terms of possession, and confidentiality. There were also audios, old recordings of meetings in which Margaret and Andrew discussed my strategic removal from the company. I listened to each segment in silence, like a calm witness to my own judgment. Nothing surprised me, but everything strengthened me. Elliot explained the legal limits we built over the years. Many of them approved by Andrew without even reading. There were dates, signatures, digital records, and even voice recordings in which Margaret said, laughing, that a woman doesn't need to be in charge if she is well manipulated. Hearing that with proof was painful, but at the same time liberating. It wasn't paranoia. It was a conspiracy. And now it was recorded, stamped, and sealed. No one could erase the truth I held in my hands. Everything is legally shielded. Elliot paused and then took out an envelope separate from the others. Inside was a complete dossier of emails exchanged between Margaret and an external legal consultant. The intention was clear. She wanted to legally remove me from the company, using clauses regarding mental health and emotional instability. The dates matched periods when I felt more vulnerable, exhausted, and isolated. She tried to build a narrative to paint me as incapable. But she failed because even on my worst days I was still stronger than all of them together. I held those sheets with firm hands. I felt no anger, I felt relief. It was as if all the pieces finally fit together. Margaret didn't just want to take advantage of my money. She wanted to erase my name from what I myself had built. She wanted to take the empire that was never hers, wearing a mantle of authority she never had. I knew I needed to act with more precision now. It wasn't enough to bring them down. It was necessary to record everything, to document every fall. She wanted to take the empire that was never hers. I recorded a video. Not an outburst, not an emotional revenge, but a silent, firm confession with dates, facts, and evidence. In the video, I described the manipulations, the diversions, and the hidden plans. I spoke with clarity, looking directly into the camera, like someone writing a definitive sentence. Elliot followed everything, sitting beside me, confirming data and handing over evidence at the end of each segment. That wasn't about a scandal. It was about justice. I didn't need the media. I only needed the right timing. In the late afternoon, Andrew arrived and found me in the office. Elliot handed him an envelope that looked harmless. Inside was a contract. Andrew didn't even look. He took the pen and signed automatically, as he always did. When he finished, Elliot closed the folder with a dry click and looked him in the eyes. Congratulations, Andrew. You have just given up everything. It took him a few seconds to understand. And then, he looked at me with the expression of a man defeated by his own negligence. Andrew signs without reading his own ruin. Andrew woke up believing he still controlled some part of his own life. He dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, as if appearances could still protect him. He received the summons to appear at the company headquarters and thought it would be to resolve some bureaucracy, as he called it. He was confident, walking with the stride of someone who believed he belonged at the top. At the reception he smiled, gave his name, and waited for his access badge with an automatic arrogance. The young woman looked at the system, hesitated for a few seconds, and then handed him a white badge without a photo. Visitor, the plastic-covered paper said. Andrew frowned and laughed awkwardly, as if it were a mistake. I am a partner, you see, my name is Sullivan SUL. She smiled politely. Sir, the system shows no formal link to the company. Security escorted him to the meeting room while he tried to maintain his pose, not realizing he was already an intruder in what he thought was his world. The badge said visitor. Elliot received him with a neutral handshake and gestured for him to sit. The room was cold and silent, with a screen turned on showing organization charts and records. Andrew still tried to smile, but the discomfort was already weighing on him. Elliot then began the presentation. He explained with surgical detail the terms of the corporate fund. You were never a partner, Andrew. The entire corporate structure was built by Madeline. You enjoyed the power, but you never had it. Andrew's eyes widened, confused. What do you mean? I signed contracts. Elliot then displayed the signatures. All of them authorized temporary powers. All the documents showed that he was legally a dependent. You were benefited, yes, but through trust, through generosity, through convenience. And now that concession has been withdrawn. Andrew ran his hands through his hair, restless. He tried to argue, saying he contributed, that he represented the company at events, that he was the public face of the business. Elliot only smiled, impassive. Power was a gift. That has been revoked. Power was a gift. That has been revoked. Andrew stood up. He walked in circles around the room like a caged animal. Anger exploded in nonsensical words, in a desperate attempt to maintain some control. This is absurd. I'm going to sue. This is a scam. The executives present remained silent. They looked at him as if he were just another annoying visitor. Elliot collected the documents, closed the folder firmly, and said only, "The meeting is over." Andrew tried to follow him, but the automatic door to the room closed before he could exit. He banged on the door. He shouted for answers, but no one came back. No one heard him. That room, which had received him so many times with flattery and expensive coffee, now trapped him in the cruelest silence. For the first time, Andrew had to face the echo of his own mistakes, without an audience, without applause, without excuses to save him. The door to power had closed, and he didn't even notice when he was invited to leave. Or worse, when he was never invited to enter. The meeting room door closes with him on the outside. The black sports car was waiting for him at the exit, exactly where he had asked Betrayal to pick him up. She was in the driver's seat, typing something on her phone, with sunglasses covering half her face. Andrew got in, throwing his briefcase on the back seat, and began to speak without breathing. About betrayal, about Elliot, about a legal trap, about how they needed to stay together now more than ever. Betrayal listened to him for a few seconds, then sighed. She took off her glasses, looked directly at him, and said, "Are you broke?" The answer came in an uncomfortable silence. He looked away. "Things are complicated at the moment, but I have contacts, I can turn this around." Betrayal let out a dry laugh, took her purse, and opened the door. "I don't sleep with promises." She left the car with the same lightness with which she had entered his life months ago, leaving behind a man who only now realized he was never indispensable. She got out of the car without looking back. Andrew returned home with a vacant expression. Margaret was waiting for him in the living room, anxious, her hair still perfectly pinned. He tried to tell her what had happened, but he couldn't finish the sentence. She understood. She sat on the sofa, put her hands to her mouth, and remained in silence for a few minutes. Later she tried to react. She called friends, asked for meetings, looked for events where she could show herself as present again. But something had already changed. The invitations disappeared. Calls were not returned. In her group of influential friends, conversations now continued without her participation. One of them discreetly removed her from the list of patrons for the social committee. Others began to talk about her in low voices at the corners of cafes. She lives off her daughter-in-law's money, they said. She always pretended to be the matriarch, but she was nothing. Margaret tried to justify herself. She tried to deny it. She tried to lead. But no one obeyed her anymore. The social empire she built on appearance evaporated with the speed of shame. The group left the chat. Meanwhile, I observed the world in silence. I sat on the porch of the house, still surrounded by the remnants of former luxury, and breathed for the first time without feeling a weight in my chest. The night breeze touched my face, and I no longer needed to smile out of obligation. My eyes didn't seek approval. My posture was no longer armor. It was freedom. I knew I had one. Not just by bringing down the guilty, but by keeping myself whole, intact, even in the face of their collapse. I took a glass of wine, put on some instrumental music, and closed my eyes. I let the past dissolve into every note. I remembered the woman I was, and the woman I am now. I no longer needed to scream to exist. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They fell one by one exactly as they built their masks. Fragile. But my justice was not yet complete. Because what I am building goes beyond the fall. It goes toward reconstruction. But she had not finished yet. The invitation was simple, almost silent. For those who have already built in silence. There were no stamp sponsors. There were no faces on billboards. And yet the auditorium filled up as if it were a reunion of souls. Those women knew why they were there, even without completely understanding how or when. Some came from the financial market, others from politics, science, or education. And all of them, without exception, carried in their gaze the same invisible scar. That of someone who has already been discredited for being too brilliant. When I walked backstage, I felt a different strength. Not fear, not nervousness, but the exact gravity of occupying a space that, for a long time, was denied to me. I went up on stage alone. There was no host, no opening music or gala script. Just a spotlight and a microphone. I took a deep breath. The entire hall fell silent. For years, women were trained to be discreet. To serve, to give in, to sustain without drawing attention. But today what brought us here was not silence. It was resistance. I felt my chest open as if invisible weights were being lifted from my ribs. I continued. I am Madeline Carter. And I am here to say that none of us will be silenced, erased, or replaced anymore. I spoke of myself, yes, but I spoke through everyone. I told how I was sabotaged in an elegant way. How my husband used my structure, my mother-in-law used my reputation, and my pain was wrapped up to look like weakness. I said how I stopped occupying rooms to avoid embarrassment, how I accepted fake smiles thinking they were respect, how I blamed myself every time I dared to want more. I didn't mention names. I didn't mention personal details, but the message was direct. Whoever needed to understand would understand. And whoever had never lived this, let them learn to listen. I didn't mention names, but everyone understood. Once the speech was over, the silence remained for a few seconds. One of those silences that isn't uncomfortable, that reverberates. And then came the applause, not explosive, but long and continuous, like those following a victory procession. That was when I announced the true reason for that night. The creation of an investment and mentoring fund exclusive to women sabotaged by their own inner circle. You know what I'm talking about, I said. It isn't the enemy outside who hurts us most. It's the partner who weakens us. It's the manager who praises us while diverting us. It's the mother who teaches us to be quiet. I asked them to look around, to notice who was beside them. We are not competitors. We are survivors. And now we are architects. I explained that the project would not be charitable. It would be strategic. A council formed by leading women. A network of capital, legal, and emotional support, made to shield female trajectories. So that no one else ever has to be quiet to be accepted. The participants would be owners, not guests. The shares would be real. The votes shared. The decisions transparent. Here, competence will be the only requirement. And silence the only enemy. While I spoke, I observed the eyes that followed me. I saw there the same women who had already swallowed injustices with cold coffee in a meeting. Those who had already smiled at dinners full of disguised insults. Those who were called difficult for not accepting little. In every face I recognized versions of myself. The Madeline of 20, trying to be heard without appearing aggressive. The Madeline of 30, accepting emotional crumbs for fear of being alone. And now, at 42, looking at all of it as history. It hurt, but it was a clean hurt. When I finished, I left the stage as I had entered, without haste. But now I was no longer alone. Women followed me. Some approached in silence, just holding my hand. Others said thank you with tears in their eyes. Elliot, in the back, followed everything in silence. He knew that was the true end of the game. What I began in pain was now transforming into a legacy. Not just for me but for all who came before and had no voice. And for all who are yet to come. Now my voice echoes in the hallways. Upon leaving the auditorium, I looked at the clear city sky. The lights of the avenue no longer blinded me. I saw with clarity. The game had changed. Margaret, Andrew, Brielle. They had all crumbled under their own contempt. But not I. I chose to grow in silence, and now I spoke with authority. For the first time I didn't just feel avenged. I felt whole. The empire they took from me I reclaimed with strategy. But what I am building now is greater. It is collective, it is solid, it is irreversible. It was the beginning of a different dynasty. The house was in absolute silence that morning. No sound of dishes being set, no perfume in the air. No sign of the comfort from before. Only Elliot's firm steps crossing the hallway with the black briefcase in hand. Inside it, there were no promises or negotiations. Only documents. Final, definitive, and non-appealable documents. He looked at me before entering the main room. Are they coming together? I asked. Yes. They arrive in 15 minutes. I took a deep breath. It was strange how calm my body was. As if I had already mourned all of it a long time ago. Margaret arrived first, as always. Andrew followed her, thinner, paler, with the look of someone who still thought everything would be resolved with a good speech. She wore a beige coat and a pearl necklace. He wore a light blue suit and polished shoes. They tried to appear in control. I greeted them with a slight nod. No kiss, no handshake. Only silence. We pointed to the chairs in front of the glass table. There were no flowers. There was no coffee. There was only what they had never seen until then, limits. Elliot began the formal reading. We are here to formalize the dissolution of any corporate, financial, property, or legal link between Madeline Carter and Mr. Andrew Sullivan and Mrs. Margaret Sullivan. Margaret interrupted immediately, laughing with contempt. This is just to formalize what is already resolved, right? Elliot ignored her. He continued. Andrew remained silent until he heard the term irrevocable waiver, and then he frowned. What is he talking about, Madeline? He asked in an almost irritated tone. I stared at him without answering. It was then that Elliot read in a firm voice. Clause 16.7. Total, permanent, and irrevocable waiver, signed in March of 20XX, with the signature of Mr. Andrew Sullivan. He hesitated. He reached out, pulled the paper and saw there in cold letters his own signature. Now this isn't. I thought it was an advance on participation. Elliot didn't even blink. You didn't read it. Margaret took the papers from his hands and began to stammer. But this isn't fair. It's the family business. He widened his eyes upon seeing the forgotten clause. Andrew remained motionless as if he needed time to process that, for the first time, his word would have no weight. Margaret tried to react with that sharp tone she always used to manipulate dinners and family meetings. Are you doing this to us out of revenge, Madeline? I did not answer. Elliot, with extreme elegance, answered for me. She is simply ending what you believed you could keep under control. They no longer knew what to say. For the first time there was no ground to stand on. No disguise. No lie that fit into that contract. The stamp was taken out of the briefcase. Elliot adjusted the paper, pressed the rubber over the ink, and stamped the last page with a dry sound, almost ceremonial. That wasn't just bureaucracy. It was the official end of their influence over me. Nothing more belonged to them. Not the cards, not the accounts, nor the facade they used as status. And more than that, they no longer belonged to my narrative. They didn't know it, but they had been excluded from the only place where they truly had importance. The dry sound of the stamp was the last word. Andrew stood up abruptly, his face red, his voice trembling. "You can't do this to me. I was by your side. I supported you." Margaret tried to calm him, saying they could contest it, that it was nothing more than a document. But his voice grew louder. "You are destroying our family." He reached his arm toward me. "Madeline, talk to me. Look at me. I am still your husband." That word husband sounded so out of place that it almost made me laugh. Not out of contempt but out of lucidity. That was what he still clung to. An identity that no longer existed. My response did not come in the form of a speech. It did not come in a high tone or in tears. It came in silence. I remained seated, looking at him as if he were a stranger. Because he was. The man before me was not the same one who took advantage of my strength for years. He was only what was left of him when the masks fell. Margaret cried, trying to maintain her posture. But even she no longer knew what to do. Her social games, her well-placed phrases, her subtle blackmails. All of them collapsed under the dry weight of a legal stamp. I stood up without saying anything. I walked to the door with firm steps, without hesitating. I heard Andrew's voice behind me, trying one last appeal. "Are you just going to leave like this?" Without saying a word. I felt for a moment an old urge to explain. But it passed. Because they no longer deserved the sound of my voice. They didn't deserve access to the woman who had finally come back to herself. I touched the doorknob, took a deep breath, and with a simple movement, closed that chapter with the same firmness with which I lived my reconstruction. She turns her back without a single word. Now I am curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever gone through something similar? Support the channel, subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. I am leaving another story on the end screen that you will also like, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until the next video.